Within the nobility class of the feudal system, vassals, fiefs, lords, and knights were key pieces. We will look at the role each one played.
Throughout feudalism, vassals held an important relationship with their lords. Vassals had to fulfill obligations to the royals in their court. Essentially, vassals did whatever the lords needed them to do. Additionally, vassals were political alliances with their lords, and were there as support and to pledge allegiance to the leader. This allegiance is also known as fealty. Fealty is essentially a promise to always be there for the lord. If this promise were to be broken by the vassal, it would be considered a felony, and vassals could be punished greatly. The relationship between vassals and lords was usually strong with this element of fealty. What made it even stronger was an homage. Homage was a type of ceremony performed by the lord and vassal that displayed the vassal's fealty. This ceremony solidified the relationship between vassals and lords. Alongside having political alliance with their lord, vassals were also required to help upholding justice, help financially when needed, and help fulfill military obligations in times of war. This put vassals in a very important, prominent position. Vassals were asked to uphold justice, mainly within their lord's court. Because of the relationship between lord and vassal, the vassal would support the lord's legal decisions when needed. The vassal's financial responsibilities were to pay off taxes or other debts, and payments that the lord could not make. Essentially, vassals would lend money to their lord so they would not reach into debt with other lenders. Also, a vassal was responsible for making sure the lord and company were fed when traveling. In addition to legal and financial obligations, vassals had military obligations. These obligations were to be filled mainly in times of war. When needed, vassals were asked to lead parts of the military for their lord during wars. Fiefs acted as a contract between a lord and a vassal. It was the foundation of feudalism. Under certain obligations, vassals would be granted a portion of land in exchange for their services to their lord. This would be known as an oath of homage and fealty. The term originally came from the Latin word beneficium and was first ushered by the Roman Empire. The oath required the vassal to pledge in both fealty and homage. The pledge in homage meant for the vassal to be the man of their lord. Pledging fealty meant to uphold their lord's aforementioned obligations. The ceremony would often begin with the vassal kneeling before their lordship, and then their lord would clasp their hands with the vassals and share a kiss. The significance of the ceremony is to establish obedience and reassure that the vassal remained faithful.
To begin, one might ask who a lord is or was, and to begin, for the most part, they were males who ran manors provided by the king, and were also given authority over others, these others usually being villagers in the village they overlooked or peasants, and before they could become a lord, they had to be considered noble. To continue, lifestyle and housing-wise, lords were very, very wealthy, and they had a very good means of living. Their clothing, for starters, was made from the best fabrics, and they were also very educated, meaning that they usually spoke more than one language and had a bigger appreciation for the arts. And to go along with them being so wealthy, they lived in the manors, obviously provided by the king, which were usually the size of a small village. And their home is also where they like to entertain many guests with lavish dinners consisting of pricey spices and meats. Military-wise, lords were often considered knights and could be called into battle at any time, but for the most part, they were just required to provide soldiers for the king whenever it was needed, and they were also highly trained in martial arts and obviously raising private armies. Peasant and land-wise, the lords were given fiefs, aka land, by the king, but with this came a few strings attached. The lord would usually had to pay taxes to the king and again provide military services. With the land, the lord was given absolute power, so basically anything he said had to be followed, pretty much meaning that the lord's word was the law. And along with the land came villagers and peasants. Usually if the manor overlooked a village, some of the villagers might even work the land, but for the most part, usually just peasants who the lord would lease the land to. And these peasants usually paid rent and provided food for the lord and his family by working said land.
Knighthood was a title given to the son of a nobleman after he went through training. It was a title that had to be earned. The word knight is an Anglo-Saxon word, knight, literally translated to boy. Knights were above peasants, but were not necessarily rulers. It was a career path that the younger sons of nobles found appealing to gain fame and fortune. The first step was being a page. A boy would spend the first 7 years at his home. Then he would move into another nobleman's house, who was usually a knight, to begin his journey. He would be a page for the next 7 years. During this time, he was essentially a servant boy that did whatever he was told. He was also taught to read and write, religion, and how to hunt. He would play fight with the other boys, trying to copy what the knights did. At 14, the boy would take an oath to be a squire at a religious ceremony. He would take a sacred sword and swear that he'd use it for honorable and religious purposes. A squire was charged with one of various roles that included being a personal servant or housekeeper, stocking shelves, taking care of the dinner table or wine cellar, caring for armor and weapons, and event managing. This taught the squire the social and chivalrous side of knighthood. He also trained in martial arts and horse care, and practiced sword fighting with the knights. He was a personal assistant to his knight and wore armor to get used to the weight. If a knight fell in battle, the squire would protect him, and the knight could grant him knighthood. At the age of 21, the squire graduated. The knighting ceremony, or accolade, took place on special occasions. The squire would dress in white and be bathed, and then after a long vigil, he would swear an oath which included to always defend a lady and the poor and the weak, to be utterly honest, loyal, devoted to God and church, charitable, punctual, and brave. Then he would be dubbed by an upperclassman or his father, if his father was also a knight, on the shoulders with a sword, as a subtle reminder that the master of the ceremony could kill him if he wanted to. Chivalry emerged in the form that we recognize it today around the 1100s, right after the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. It was then that it became a set of structured rules. The word itself is derived from an old French word, chevalerie, meaning horse soldiery. In the beginning, it just referred to any aristocrat in the military that rode a horse. In fact, the Italian equivalent for the word during that time was cavalry. It started off as a code for how a knight would conduct himself on the battlefield. Many of the points mentioned in the knight's oath were all part of chivalry, including loyalty, bravery, and protecting the weak. The church accepted the idea of a holy war but wanted to make sure that the knights were not corrupted, so it heavily supported and influenced this code of conduct. It was so honorable that Usman ibn Munqidh, a Muslim soldier, requested to take his nephew to learn of it. In time, it evolved into a code of governing and conduct for the behavior of the upper class as a whole, detailing morals, religion, love, and conduct in war. Because of its evolution, it impacted the medieval views on romantic relationships, hunting, law, literature, and even fashion. It evolved the entire culture of that time. The code was a manual that helped people rise up in ranks and respect. Here we see the Code of Chivalry according to the Song of Roland and Leon Gautier's 10 Commandments. As we have shown, vassals, fiefs, lords, and knights played a very important role for the nobility class of the feudal system. The strength and structure of the feudal system heavily depended on these 4 topics. We hope that you have enjoyed our presentation. Thank you and goodbye.